This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network. In today's episode, I have two guests. The first is Matt Galvin, the Vice President, Ethics and Compliance at Anheuser-Busch. The second is Peter Grossman, the co-founder and Chief Strategist at Gadfly. They are from very different professional backgrounds, but they came together on a project that Peter assisted Matt on, which was compliance training. It's a fascinating exploration of some of the most effective compliance training I've heard of recently. I know you will enjoy it, and I hope that you will consider some of the steps that Matt took that Peter assisted him with for your own compliance training, as I'm sure that it will help make your compliance training more entertaining and effective. Thank you. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and you are in for a real treat today because I have with me two gentlemen, Matt Galvin, the Global VP of Ethics and Compliance at Ab-InBev, and Peter Grossman. Peter is the co-founder of Labyrinth Training, and we're here today to talk about their collaborative efforts to come up with some of the most innovative compliance training that I've heard about in some time. So with that introduction, gentlemen, first of all, welcome and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for having us, Tom.
So, Matt, I think most compliance professionals are either aware of you, your name, or the work that Ab-InBev has done around compliance. So perhaps you could set up the problem or issue you were trying to solve in your training, and then Peter can jump in and talk about how he was able to assist you in that.
Sure, Tom. I mean, as I've been in this role, there's a few things that I prioritize now much more than I did when I first came over from an external law firm. And one of those things is training. You know, as an external lawyer, you kind of view training as something that you want to show you have done, that it's important. I remember, years ago on, the Morgan Stanley case where they had that guy who ran afoul of a lot of issues in China, and they decided to charge the guy in not Morgan Stanley. It was Garth Peterson was the guy. And I remember Justice and a lot of people, of my generation of compliance remember distinctly that, Morgan Stanley showed that there was something like, and don't hold me to this number, but like 28 separate instances of training that the guy went through to show that Morgan Stanley had a great and effective compliance program. And that became the standard, that you want to show a lot of training, you want to have it documented, and you want to be able to show that. But query if he went through training 28 times and did it anyway, how effective was that training? And do I want to be in the position where I'm showing that I did a lot of training over and over again? Or do I want to be in the position where maybe you can think a little more of people and maybe you can reach to them and maybe training can actually influence behavior? And we started down this road roughly a year ago to say, how do I actually find compliance training that isn't just about documenting that the training went on, but that actually could potentially influence? And I said, well, what is influential? And I looked in the market, and to be honest, I didn't see anything in the market that led me to believe it could influence training. There's all sorts of things about kind of certain analytics profiles. Some companies had done a little bit of a job of trying to create narrative storytelling, but none of it was particularly engaging, and all of it was too long. And, Peter and I have known each other for years, actually, but not professionally. And, we've talked a lot about kind of our work, and after kind of years of knowing each other, and we know each other because we coach Little League together. And if anything, if you've ever coached Little League, there's a lot of time watching young, 8-year-olds walk people. And in the walks, you start talking about everything. And so I started talking about my problems, and Peter started.
Yeah, so, my partner Scott Petz and I come from a very different background from Matt, and it's just a completely different world. We come from entertainment and publishing and that sort of world. And so when we started our production company, we were imagining ourselves to be in that space more. We've done work for different publications, for HBO, things like that. But what we realized when talking to Matt was that there was this gap there in this industry, in this world that we didn't know anything about. Matt mentioned a lot of time that we spent together talking on the Little League field, and it was there where he asked me, hey, do you think you can make a compliance training that my employees will actually pay attention to? And I said, well, yeah, we make things that people pay attention to. That's what we do. But what's a compliance training? And so we had to sort of start from not knowing anything. And I think that helped us a little bit, because as we started to look at what was in the market, a lot of PowerPoint slide decks, things like that were very dry. They checked all the boxes, but they didn't necessarily have an eye towards actually communicating to people. We realized that our background sort of puts us in a unique spot here to bring something different. And that's what we've been trying to do from the beginning is just to engage people, to entertain them. So when the education part hits, their minds are open and they're willing to listen to it. They're paying attention, quite frankly, to what it is that they need to be paying attention to.
So Matt, let me pick up on Peter's last point, because I've seen a fair amount of compliance training that is entertaining, but that really wasn't what you were looking for. I think I wrote this down right. You were looking for training that could influence behavior, and I would perhaps even add, be able to demonstrate the effectiveness. So how were you able to work with Peter to get from entertaining, engaging training to training that actually influenced behavior?
Yeah, and I think there's two parts to that, right? One is the training itself, and the other is how do you measure if it worked. And so let's start with the training itself. I mean, I work in an environment of great professionals. We have 160,000 people. We're proud. We work in 400 different brands of beer. But we're, as a culture, very ownership-oriented and very, very interested in learning. And I could take advantage of that culture that really prizes learning and say, if I could capture attention, they're willing to learn. The catch is that you have to capture attention. And for that, you need a few things, right? As a lawyer, one of the first things I realized is I needed an editor, because no matter how engaged people are in learning, they're not going to be engaged for an 80-minute or 60-minute compliance training, particularly if there's a law school style exam at the end. So the first thing I had to do was make it shorter. The second is the objective of the training had to be a little bit different. We went through a bunch of different ways, and a lot of lawyers would be like, well, let's start with the law. Well, that's a great way to lose anybody who's not a lawyer, is starting with the law, right? Let's start with the issue. And let's start with the issue and then come up with real life experiences that can teach the issue and kind of show what will happen if you don't think through the consequences of your actions, and show seemingly benign situations. An interaction with an old college buddy who worked at a competitor, or sending an email and the implications that can have on cybersecurity and data privacy. Seemingly mundane things, and then show people what consequences can happen if they don't think through all the legal issues that are there. You'll see in our trainings, we don't really mention the law, and we don't cite statute. What we do is show what the law is trying to get to, and then people can take away from that.
Yeah, to just jump on what Matt's saying, the policies are all in there, even where the law isn't. But ABI's policies are in all of those trainings. It's how they're delivered, as opposed to looking at just points on a slide. The way that we get to that is by sitting with Matt and his team and saying, hey, how do you guys screw this up? How have you guys messed up? What are the mistakes that people make in this area? And so much comes from just hearing people talk. Oh, well, okay, so let's say there's a guy and you're going to open a brewery and you have to secure land. Well, you're going to be approached by the governor. You're going to be approached by all these politicians, some of whom may be corrupt. And how do you navigate that? Now, for someone like me who has a background from Rolling Stone and Us Weekly and places like that, I never came in contact with anything like this before. The closest I have is the paparazzi, and they're way more compliant than most of the things that happen that Matt's concerned about. And so hearing those stories, you realize that that's where information is shared. I learned way more about how to handle corruption by hearing the stories that Matt has about this local governor or that local figure, whatever, whoever it may be, and hearing what actually happens. Because you can tell people to read it in a book, and that's not the same thing as what they're likely to experience. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and then it goes into how do you measure the impact? And Tom, I'm really into analytics, and I'm really into how do I actually measure and quantify the impact of compliance? Because I don't think compliance should only be process. I do think we need to have an impact on the organization, and we need to be accountable to our organizations for the impact that we have. And so we look at, how do we do that with training? Well, in some things, we look at whether it raises awareness of whistleblower lines. And as I roll, certain trainings out, say it's a sexual harassment training, what I would expect to see an impact on reported cases of harassment. Similarly with data privacy, that we'd expect to see more engagement with the data privacy function as a result of the training. But I also learned from Peter and Scott and the Labyrinth folks to look at what about the impact of the training itself or the interaction with the training? And it raises questions to me that I want to explore other metrics. For example, our trainings, most of them are multiple choice. And you go down one path, and some trainings you'll see it all no matter what you do. And others you only see part of it and kind of snippets of the other piece. But is the training good enough that people want to watch it again? That's an entertainment metric. Or how fast do people make choices? If they were presented with an A and B, how quickly do they interact with that? Or is there like a lull or a gap between, the end of a narrative structure and the choice point, which suggests maybe someone isn't engaged? And taking these sort of metrics, from the entertainment world, from the social media world, and applying them to compliance training is fascinating to me in ways that we're looking into how to actually measure kind of the interaction with the training. Well, when the confines of kind of measuring the overall impact on the environment at large. And that not everyone takes that view, and there's products in the market that take a different view from that. But that's where we're going with this.
So, Peter, audience satisfaction would seem to be something that you've thought about quite a bit in your prior life and your current life. How does that fit into what Matt just described?
We hear so often from every client that we speak to about how I had one person that we spoke with that had a new baby and said that, we could just play our compliance trainings if I need to put them to sleep. And it's the same story over and over again. We've got this. It's not that people are wondering what what trainings are. They just have things that are not particularly engaging. And, we found that it's the same with anything. I mean, if you want to be there, if you're more engaged, if you're being spoken to and not at, you have a better experience and you're more willing to learn. I mean, if you think back at all the best teachers you ever had, going back to kindergarten, it's always the ones that were outside of the box, that weren't the ones that are just reading you something out of a textbook. It was the people that got the class up, that got people talking, that got you engaged. And so every decision that we make with all the storytelling is geared towards sticking in someone's head. We don't need you to remember every single line of the FCPA. We want you to remember the situation that we put you in this training about whether or not you were supposed to buy those cows. That you'll remember. And ultimately, what I think people in Matt's position are looking for are for his employees to just stop and think, or just pick up the phone and call compliance or call whoever, depending on the issue. Make the call to somebody. And if the only option for you is, should you A, do this, B, do this, or C, call compliance, everyone's going to just click C and call compliance, and that'll be the end of it. And so we always remove that as an option for what people can do. We show them all the different paths that sound like they're right, and sometimes they're all right. But but that have something wrong with it, some sort of attachment to it that says, oh, wait a minute, this is what could go wrong here. And we find that, if those are the kinds of things that you'll remember. You'll remember the journey that you were sent on. You'll make associations to things. It's sort of the difference between a piece of sheet music where it has all the notes there and you look down on it, and anyone who can read music can look at it and say, okay, I see what this is supposed to sound like, and hearing a symphony. It's a completely different experience, and the thing on the piece of paper isn't music. It's the sound that you hear that's the music. And so Matt's policies, are the sheet music. That's the guidelines for which we're trying to, get information across. But the trainings become the music. The trainings become the thing that you sit in, that you remember, that you have an experience around. And that's a much more powerful way to get a message across than to just sort of read it out of a textbook.
And I remember, Tom, when I was first doing this, we first did the beta version of the first training. And we sit in an open office environment. And I opened it up and I was watching it on my computer screen. And, it was a 7-minute training. And within 2 minutes of playing in kind of low volume, I guess I'm not a great office neighbor. I wasn't wearing headphones. But I had 8 people go by who stopped what they were doing just to watch the training. And I was like, this is amazing. This is not something that we're required to do. People actually willingly stopped to watch a compliance training. And that was really gratifying. And I think we're still only kind of early on this journey because, we've made 5 different modules now, and we have kind of, we have another 7 in the pipeline. And what we're starting to see is, as Peter and Scott explore, is there's a little narrative world, and the cartoon characters recycle and come up, and they take on kind of embodiment of certain messages. And, being a company of brands at Ab-InBev, I understand the power of a brand. And there's a clear opportunity that we could rebrand compliance and have, the chief in the corruption story be a t-shirt wearing of corruption, or the cows be part of a t-shirt. And we can do compliance messaging with the characters. And the beautiful thing about that is, as much as we got everything to like 7-8 minute training increments. Now with an image, you get that kind of, Apple brand moment where you see an Apple and you associate it with the iPhone and cool products. And now you see the character and people will associate that with compliance. And there's a lot out there that says the key to kind of effective compliance communication isn't one long hour training. It's kind of constant reminders. And just to be an ever-present kind of Jiminy Cricket on the shoulder. And the way to get there is through this kind of, at least the way we're seeing a path to get there, is this ever-present imagery that allows us to simplify our language and approach people through a more base and more branded level.
Matt, it occurs to me that your workforce, the vendors, your high-risk supply chain vendors, and perhaps high-risk on the sales side, make Ab-InBev as diverse an corporation in the world as there is, in terms of the number of employees you have and where you guys do business, which I have to assume is literally everywhere. Are you able to do the second part of what the DOJ talks about in training, in addition to effectiveness, but targeted training through this message system?
It's interesting, and you're right. One thing that makes our footprint a little bit different is that, as global as we are, beer is local. The supply chain's local. The grain is heavy, bottles are heavy, beer is heavy. So our workforces, you're right, are parts of the communities where they operate, which is very different from, say, a tech company. If you make cell phones, you probably make them in 1 or 2 countries, and then you sell them in the other 160. Beer doesn't work like that typically. And for me, we're approaching that in a couple of different ways, and it's part of the evolution of the process. And how do you reach and make relevant, training to people, and how do you influence behavior? Because you're right, what's going to influence, a senior executive in New York is probably different than what will speak to a sales rep in Lago. And, some of it we're trying to do by making it short and engaging, and the storylines are powerful. And, we're translating in 14 different languages and kind of covering kind of basic things like that. But where we're moving towards is, I said we've done 5 and we have, 7 in the pipeline, is, many of them are of the storylines can relate to things that an ordinary person, many people in the workforce are going to do, like sending an email is the first part of data privacy. Is what do you need to think about before you send an email, and then what can go wrong? Well, and even in my company, that probably covers maybe 1/3 of my workforce. 2/3 probably don't use email for work on a daily basis, right? They're brewing beer, they're selling beer, they're not sending emails. So we're actually taking another group of trainings that are going to be focused at different segments of the population. And the idea is to create and promote, and I'm stealing this a little bit from Hui Chen, ethical bystanders. One of the things we looked at when we were learning and kind of upgrading our sexual harassment training is the best thing to do in harassment is, some people would say, well, you got to train the men. Traditionally you train, a lot of the more likely victims, in this case, the women, about what it is to be harassed, but they kind of already know. The better thing to do, and what I thought was the most compelling to me and where our training is focused, is to train both about what to do if they see it happening them around them, and remove the risk of complicity to bad behavior of harassment. And there was a really good op-ed in the New York Times about a year ago that told the story of a woman on a train seeing another woman being harassed, and she was eating a bag of chips in the train. And what she thought to do was start taking the chips and eat them very loudly and messily and kind of start dribbling chips everywhere, which distracted both the person harassing as well as the victim and allowed the woman who was being the victim a chance to escape. And that got me thinking that that's a concept that could be applied almost anywhere. And we could take training and orient them at functions, let's say a sales function, and say, what misconduct do you see around you that you should raise awareness of? Same with back office functions. We're taking a training aimed at people that work in back office and the ones that are processing transactions and doing all that kind of nuts and bolts that every organization needs. What misconduct do they see? And project it not so much to educate them, but to educate what they should kind of raise their hand about. And how do you promote a culture where people are willing to raise their hand and raise an ethical challenge? And then my other part of my job is to provide a function that can do something about it. And that's a concept that I think will transcend, that will work in the 90 countries where we are, and that we can use and really tell a story and really kind of hopefully change behavior.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on what Matt's saying, I mean, it's not about training, like finding all the nefarious people in your organization and saying, okay, we need to get them because they're likely to do bad. I mean, you'll find that, no one thinks that they're doing something wrong, especially at the beginning of one of these processes, whether it's corruption or, honestly, there's the vast majority, Matt brings up harassment. It's not the guy that is just going to go up to any woman and be horrible no matter what that you're trying to train. Hopefully the hiring process has weeded those people out. But in the cases where it hasn't, it's the guy next to that guy that's standing there watching it happen that you need to get to. It's the person, like Matt's saying, that sees the weird transactions going through and maybe has a chance to say something. It's not about reaching the villain. It's about reaching the community at large, so when they see a villain, where they see villainous behavior, I should say, they know to point it out. We're big believers in there are no good people or bad people. There's just people that have their own motivations. And so when you see something that someone is doing, it's not about necessarily, oh, look, that horrible person. It's, hey, that's a bad thing that's happening, and we need to blow the whistle on that thing. And so creating an environment where people feel comfortable speaking about it, which is why, the anti-retaliation, for example, segment is such a prominent part of our harassment training. And also just letting them know, hey, what to do? Am I supposed to call someone? What do I do here? Just so that they know that there is something to do, so they aren't standing by. I mean, that's the whole hope, is that you're educating the masses to all sort of point at the same thing together, as opposed to trying to weed out all the individual problems.
So, Peter, I was really intrigued. One of your early remarks when you said you were first discussing this project with Matt, and it was along the lines of, what's compliance training? But I was wondering, were there any real surprises for you in this process? Or if not surprises, were there some insights that you had not anticipated coming across really throughout your phase of the creative process?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the thing that stood out the most, and from the beginning, and continues to sort of hit me upside the head every time I come in contact with it, is that we in our previous roles in our previous industry, we spent so much time and energy on things like headlines and magazine covers or leads to videos, things like that, because it's so important to capture your user. And we were doing that for things that were not necessarily capital I important. It was an interview with someone from Game of Thrones, or what happened on The Bachelor last night, or things like that. But the ratio of effort put into capture someone's attention to importance is completely out of whack. There's so much energy put into capturing people's attentions for entertainment purposes, for things like that, up and down multiple industries. But there's so little attention given to how engaging something is for something that really capital M matters. Where you're talking about corruption or harassment or serious conflicts of interest, things like that. This is going to affect everyone up and down the company. This affects globally. It affects societies. And so I was surprised by it's certainly not a lack of effort. As Matt says, there's a lot of words being written down. There's no shortage of words or policies or things like that. But it's that the focus wasn't on, is this actually landing? Is this communicating? Would my employee wear a T-shirt with this on it? Sounds like a silly question when you're talking about compliance, but it matters, because that means that they're engaged in it. That means they think it's cool. That means they'll remember it. That means that when they're sitting around, they're not rolling their eyes going, oh, did you have to sit through that horrible training? They're instead going, oh, did you buy the cows? What did you do? And that sort of, we've seen it happen with the people that we work with, and we hear on the way in, it's always the same thing. Oh, no one pays attention. I was surprised that engagement wasn't a top priority. As far as sort of walking through the individual trainings and the individual steps, I sort of referenced this earlier, but I think one of the things that always makes me laugh is the perception of versus reality. For example, if you were to ask the average person on the street, who do you trust, the paparazzi or the executive? I've worked with both, and I've seen now that much more harm is done on sort of a global level in the corporate world than it ever happens in some of these things that, the used car salesman or the paparazzi or the people that have the reputation for being nefarious. That's not real. That's more upfront and honest, actually. It's when it's coordinated and a global that real damage gets done. And I think that's something that has also struck me. We're talking about doing a human rights training right now, and you realize that decisions that are being made on a daily basis that people think are business decisions. Oh, yeah, that's a good price on that land. Or, oh, sure, I'll work with that government to ensure that we can carve this part out just for business. And you think, oh, I'm making a business decision. But you're not. You're making a decision that might affect the human rights of whole nations. And I think that that's something that has really been impressed upon me, that these decisions are not necessarily made. The ones that really end up doing harm are not necessarily made by, bad actors in dark rooms with, petting their cat on, wahaha. It's not that. It's the systems that are in place that allow for it to happen, where someone just thinks they're getting a good deal, and so they make a business decision, and they don't think through what's happening on the back end. I suppose you could say that in every industry, that, people think about the consequences when they happen, but that's really struck me, that for issues such as these massive issues, corruption, harassment, human rights, that there isn't the realization that every little decision that you make as an executive might actually be impacting things other than your company.
So, Matt, is there anything about this process that, if it didn't surprise you, did it give you an insight or insights in a direction you hadn't anticipated?
Yeah, I think one byproduct of this that is super welcome is it's raised the profile and changed the conversation with compliance. Almost every head of compliance of any major company has what seems to be like a God-given right to make everybody in the company sit down and do compliance training. And yet that opportunity is taken and given, kind of short shrift, and you delegate it really down the pipeline to someone that wants to do it and kind of with minimal effort as possible, in part because the logistical challenge of then translating it and communicating it and then looking at the results can be quite laborious, but not enough time goes into content. But one of the byproducts of that is that then people look at compliance and say, oh God, you had the opportunity to talk to me and this is what you told me? Like, this is like a 45-minute exam? This is what you want to make me do? And the function itself, people kind of then, whether you realize it or not, as a compliance person, you're branding yourself as kind of boring and off the point. Where what this is doing, by even, whether it's good or not, people will walk away and said, Matt, thanks for making an effort. Thanks for really trying to reach out to me and kind of raising the level of conversation. And it seems simplistic, but just raising the level and talking to them like they're human and not lecturing them, not testing them, not analyzing them, but just saying, this is a scenario where you might need help. And this is the kind of help I can provide. This is the legal advice I can provide. And again, in the trainings, I don't use the word legal advice because, right away that has its own brand. But, by using this opportunity to reach people and elevate the conversation with them, and maybe this is me in my own little compliance bubble, but I do think you elevate the function of compliance. You elevate the conversation around ethics by taking this approach.
And the last thing you said, that is the thing that I noticed about Matt from the beginning of this process, is that it's not really compliance, it's ethics. And there's a difference between the two in the sense that compliance is really just rule following. And if you are approaching it and approaching your staff as, here are some rules to follow, you're going to get a response the same way that you get, you're flashing people back to kindergarten when they're not allowed to draw outside the lines and everybody wants to. And everyone does it anyway. And so the question is it really unethical to draw outside the lines? Well, it depends, is the answer a lot of the time. And if you can communicate to people, not just here are the rules you have to follow, but here's a general situation, and here's how we need you to act in that situation, or here are the things that you need to consider in that situation. It's a very different conversation than here are a bunch of rules to follow. And as you move the conversation more towards just the general ethics of it, instead of just here are the policy things to follow, you're having a conversation, like Matt says, you're having a conversation with people. You're not dictating to them. He's right. You do have this incredible power to just, hey, you have to watch what it is that I'm going to say to you right now. You have no choice. You can make the decision as the person implementing those trainings to make that fun. And that resonates. People go, oh, you could have made this anything you want, but you made it this fun, cool, interactive cartoon situation. And characters are flying at me and coming at me from different episodes. And, oh, I remember that guy. And that's fun. And now this thing that could have been a chore is engaging and fun and something that people look forward to instead of, oh, I have to go take that thing again, which means they're automatically tuned out.
So, gentlemen, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time, but I've been visiting today with Matt Galvin from Ab-InBev and Peter Grossman, co-founder of Labyrinth. Gentlemen, this has been a ton of fun, and perhaps the one thing I've learned is always pay attention to your Little League coach.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're talking to championship-winning Little League coaches from this year, so that's very good advice.
All right, I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. I hope that you will join us again next week for another episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. And you also check out the latest offering of the Compliance Podcast Network, which is Accountability at the Heart of Compliance, a podcast which I am co-hosting with Sam Silverstein. Sam's got some great ideas on accountability, and they're directly applicable to the compliance space. So check it out, Accountability at the Heart of Compliance. Both Accountability at the Heart of Compliance and the FCPA Compliance Report are produced by the Compliance Podcast Network. The FCPA Compliance Report is a proud part of the